Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the Headwaters Conference, 32nd Annual Headwaters Conference. We had a great session last night with Bill DeBuise, and we're really looking forward to this conversation this morning. Thanks to everyone online for joining us. Well, as your Headwaters Director, I am Micah Russell. I teach here in the Masters of Environmental Management program at Western Colorado University. And it is my privilege to introduce our moderator today, Laura Pritchett. Laura Pritchett has 5 novels that have received awards such as the PEN USA Award, the Milkweed National Fiction Prize, the Willa, the High Plains Book Award, several Colorado Book Awards, and others, as well as multiple starred reviews. She's had over 300 pieces published, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, Orion, The Sun, Salon, Terrain.org, High Country News, The Millions, Publishers Weekly, The Normal School, Writers on the Range, Ecotone, Camus, The Cincinnati Review, and many others. She's also the author of 2 nonfiction books and 1 play. Laura directs the MFA in Nature Writing at Western Colorado University and teaches around the country. This summer at Fish Trap and Elk River Writers Conference, 2 of the biggest place-based writing gatherings in the nation. She has a rule about teaching, which is that she always, without exception, focuses on climate change, since that needs to be the topic of our times. In addition, Laura is fiction editor at High Desert Journal. She's a regular op-ed columnist for the Colorado Sun and Writers on the Range, where she generally focuses on environmental issues of the West. Laura's PhD is from Purdue University and her other degrees from Colorado State. But her greatest education has come from her 2 kids, now grown, and her students, all of whom she adores beyond measure. When not writing or teaching, she can be found sauntering around the West, especially her home state of Colorado. Laura particularly likes looking at birds, stars, and clouds, tending to her orchard, and reading poetry. You can find more about Laura at Western's website or at laurapritchett.com. It is an honor and a privilege to have Laura moderate this session, and we're so pleased to continue to have her as a colleague here at Western Colorado University. Laura, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everyone. It is a beautiful day on a beautiful planet, and I am so thrilled that we have come together in community. And I thank you all for choosing to do that this morning and for welcoming us into your homes and places. So thank you. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce 2 other people and then let them speak. So I'm just going to jump right in and do that, starting with Lynne Quarmby. Lynn grew up on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and after a BS in marine biology and an MS in oceanography from the University of British Columbia, she completed her PhD in genetics and biochemistry at the University of Connecticut. 2 years of postdoctoral studies at the University of Texas led to a second postdoc and then a faculty position at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She then returned to Canada in 2000 and is now a professor of cell biology at Simon Fraser University. Here's some fun facts about her. She lives on a small island with a view across the Salish Sea to the coastal mountains of southwestern British Columbia, which I think sounds amazing. In 1979 and 80, she was a founding member of CAUSE, Citizens Against Undermining of Science Education, to counter efforts to teach creationism as science in K through 12. Thank you for that. In 2011, she was arrested for blockading a coal train. Thank you for that too. And in 2013, she filed a constitutional challenge to amendments of the National Energy Board Act in Canada regarding consideration of climate change for pipeline approval process. The next year, she and a few friends were the target of a $4.6 million lawsuit filed by a major pipeline company to prevent them from targeting the from protesting the project. That same year, she was arrested for violating the above injunction, but the case was tossed out before court appearance because the pipeline company had their GPS coordinates wrong, and they had been arrested without violating the official injunction boundary. In 2015, she ran for a seat in Canada's federal parliament. And she has written this amazing, beautiful book Watermelon Snow. And there's a quote in here that summarizes it better than I could, and is so eloquent about it that I wanted to read it. It's written by Elizabeth May, the former leader of the Green Party of Canada. And I'll just read it here. Lynn Quarmby is the most unusual of scientists. For one thing, she can write about complex science, explaining cellular biology in ways that illuminate and entertain, which is so true. For another, she is brave enough to face arrest to fight a pipeline. But this book is her bravest act yet, exposing a heart of knowing pain, a heartbreaking awareness of our collective and unprocessed grief. So that's a bit about the book, and we'll be talking about that more soon. But next, I want to go ahead and introduce Ayja Bounous, who loves snow. She loves everything about it, from the way that it smells after a snowstorm to the science behind why every snowflake has exactly 6 points, to how a pair of skis feels as it floats through a few feet of fresh powder. Born into a family of skiers and raised at the base of the Wasatch Mountains in Utah, she was immediately taught by example how to love the way water changes the landscape from one season to the next. She received a bachelor's degree in music and environmental studies from Santa Clara University, followed by a master's degree from the University of Utah's Environmental Humanities graduate program. Her book, Shaped by Snow, Defending the Future of Winter, was an effort to engage her local ski community in issues involving climate change. Her next book, AKA, she says, the bane of her existence at the moment, is part biography of her grandfather and part historical account of the American West ski industry, something that is close to many of our hearts, I know. After this, she hopes to pivot towards writing children's books that deal with environmental topics, which is awesome because we just finished a unit about just that in our nature writing program. She currently lives in Salt Lake City with her partner, surrounded by about 1,000 houseplants and as many cactus, and spends most of the year waiting for the first hint of snow in the air. And to introduce her book, I wanted to read two blurbs that again say it so well. The first by Terry Tempest Williams, who I know is much beloved by many of us. And of this book, Terry has to say, "This is a love letter and an elegy to a time when innocence could exist before the era of climate change, written with the muscularity of experience by a woman whose character was formed on the ski slopes in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. Ayja is an emerging writer of conscience. She has a beautiful voice on the page and in place, this place shaped by snow." And I also really love this quote, nice summary of the book. "In this poignant and engaging love letter to snow, Ayja beautifully interlaces science, family history, and her anxiety around climate change. This book bears witness to the changing nature of Utah and is a call to all of us to pay more attention, to choose our actions with thought, and to live with love," which I feel like was a bit of last night's message as well from Bill. That was so wonderful. So without further ado from me, could we hear from you, Lynn, and hear a bit about your book?
Absolutely. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Micah, for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here, to be part of this Headwaters conference. It has such a wonderful reputation. So I am coming to you from today, as Laura said, from Gabriola Island here in the Salish Sea. This is the unceded territory of the Shinanaimo Nation. And I just would like to acknowledge that I am here as an uninvited guest and commit myself to educating myself and doing what I can to work towards decolonization. So today I want to share my screen and share some slides with you. This is a photo of me standing on the Arctic sea ice in the summer of 2017. As many of you probably know, maybe everybody knows, the Arctic Ocean sitting on top of the North Pole is covered in sea ice. And every winter that sea ice grows in thickness and in breadth. It spreads out, and then every summer it shrinks. It breaks up like this around the edge, and it gets thinner. And it's probably no surprise to anyone that in the era of global warming, every summer it shrinks more than it grows the following winter. And so we are losing the Arctic sea ice. Scientists predict that by 10 to 40 years, somewhere in that window, we will have our first ice-free summer. So this will be profound and it'll have knock-on effects to the climate as it happens, and of course to the organisms that live here and depend on this ice. So I had the good fortune of traveling to the Arctic sea ice on the schooner in the bottom right here. It's the Antigua. We spent 15 days aboard the Antigua, sailing out of Longyearbyen in Svalbard, and 24 hours we spent tethered to this particular piece of fragment of the breakup around the edge of the summer sea ice. And the photo that I opened with was me standing on that piece of ice. You can see the gangplank there. Going north was something that I had dreamed about since I was a child. And I was quite annoyed with myself because when I finally got here, I was in a depression, I was irritable, I was frustrated, I didn't want to interact with anyone. And I'm just going to read a short poem by Mary Oliver that I use as an epigraph in my book. It's called The Uses of Sorrow. Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. As I wrote this book, I kept changing the epigraph as the book changed and evolved, and as I learned what it really was deeply about. And that poem really sums it up for me. So I'm gonna very quickly take you through that story. And forgive me for going fast, but just think of it as a collage. I spent most of my adult life studying these unicellular algae. It's a green cell. It makes the pond look a little green in the summertime. And I studied them because I studied these projections coming out the top, the flagella, the cilia. And I studied them because they're just amazing organelles, and the whole life cycle and the behavior of this single cell just absolutely fascinates me. But it's also true that because of evolution, these structures are ancient and they have much in common, the genetics, the biochemistry, the structure, with human cilia. So this is cilia in the respiratory epithelia. These cilia beat and clear our respiratory tract. These are cilia from ependymal cells in our central nervous system that move the cerebral spinal fluid. And almost every cell in the human body is ciliated. And through our research with the algae, my group discovered a gene that, when mutated, affects the localization of other proteins in the kidney. So this is a cross-section of a mouse kidney that we've stained for different proteins. And we were able to show that in certain cells, our protein was missing when mutated. And through that work, we collaborated with a human geneticist, and we discovered that this exact gene was the problem for a very severe form of juvenile polycystic kidney disease. So I show you this slide just by giving a taste of the kind of work that I did, the science that I did. I found it very meaningful. I was happy. It was intellectually satisfying. I was excited by it. I worked with amazing graduate students, but around 2005, I began to be distracted by something that I know distracts many of us who are here today. This is Ed Hawkins' spiral plot of the global mean temperature anomalies. This is above a background from 1850 to 1900, and we can see this spiral heading out to 1.5. This is something we're all familiar with. It seems like maybe that's a small thing. We know that a degree difference in our body temperature, we don't feel so good. But with climate change, climate change is a consequence of this warming. So this is data from NASA, and it shows if it will start here. This is rolling 5-year averages. This is over a higher baseline from 1951 to 1980. So we see more blue because it was cooler earlier. And we see that the distribution of this global temperature anomaly is not even. Some places are warming faster than others. And here we are in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and we hit the 2000s. I can barely watch this. The thousands of times I've watched this video, and I still am on the verge of tearing up just to see it. And of course, one of the big things here is that this uneven change in our global temperature means that, for example, the jet stream is driven by the difference in temperature between the Arctic and the subarctic. And as that difference decreases, so the Arctic is warming and there's a smaller difference, there's less energy to drive the jet stream. We get prolonged droughts, it meanders, we get weird cold fronts moving into Texas, etc. Same thing is happening at different atmospheric and oceanic currents around the globe, and that is what's underlying our messed up climate, these prolonged heat waves and droughts and hurricanes, etc. So who wouldn't be getting depressed and distracted? And I got to the point where I was so, it was just occupying my entire energy, and I wasn't able to focus on my science anymore. And this is, we saw last night, Bill showed us the Keeling Curve from 1958, which was when Charles Keeling began taking direct measurements in the atmosphere of carbon dioxide, and showed the annual oscillations and that 63-year period. This goes back 800,000 years. This is taking ice cores in the Antarctic ice and sampling the air bubbles that are frozen in the ice to look at CO2 levels as we go back in time. Now, I have to move things around here. There we go. So what we can see, these low periods in CO2 correspond to ice ages, and the high periods are interglacial periods. This flat-ish part out here is the Holocene, the last 10,000 years where we've had relative stability. This is the Eocene, the most recent interglacial period. Now, by looking at, say, for example, the location of sea shells on the side of a mountain, we can get ideas of where sea level was. So we know roughly where sea level was relative to where it is today. And by looking at the distribution of seeds and plants and a lot of other data as a proxy for temperature, we can get an estimate of global mean temperatures. And we do those things, when we do that for the Eemian, for this peak at the Eemian, sea level was maybe 10 feet. It's hard to say exactly, but roughly 10 feet above where we are today. And the temperature was 2 to 3 degrees higher than it is today. And that's with this level of CO2. So let's go across to today, and we see that, oops, this is 300 parts. This is not the edge of the curve. This is the actual data. Okay, this is not the frame of the graph. That's the data. I looked yesterday, we were at, or earlier this week, we were at 414, which is not the annual high. We were 420 in the spring. So we don't need, there are fabulous models and thousands of brilliant scientists working on modeling the climate, the atmosphere, the changes, what we can predict, what we can expect. But even without that level of sophistication, we can just look at this paleo data and we can see, just looking at the actual numbers, we can see what kind of trouble we're in. And we can see there is no room there for expanded use of fossil fuel. There's no room for building new infrastructure to handle more extraction of bitumen from the Alberta tar sands or pipelines. You can probably hear it in my voice. I still get angry. I get frustrated. And that all led me to the arrests that Laura mentioned in the introduction, arrest blocking a coal train that was, we want to make the point that the city of Vancouver was expanding its capacity to export coal. This is a poet, Stephen Collis, and I sitting out making plans, which for protesting the pipeline, which we ended up drawing the attention of Kinder Morgan and being sued. And this is getting arrested for blocking that same pipeline. And then, as Laura mentioned, the run for parliament. And all of this happened between 2011 and 2015. And in 2015, I just put myself into this heart and soul. I believed that Canada was ready to vote for climate change. We were ready to act. I believed that people understood how urgent this was. I sacrificed everything to spend 10 months, devoted myself to this election, and I ended up with 5.6% of the vote. It was very demoralizing, and not that I necessarily wanted to be a politician, but it was just demoralizing that there wasn't more support for the climate. So it took a couple of years, and eventually in 2017, in my path to healing, I found myself in the Arctic. And this is a place, especially we're here in the summertime, we have 24 hours of daylight, and we have this sort of scenery where time, it feels elastic. What time of day is it? You constant disorientation, and same with space. How big is that thing? How far away is it? I kept being in this illusory world, and it was a fabulous place to really contemplate the big questions, and to be, there's no internet, there is nothing, no dishes to wash, just away from everything and nothing to do but to think about all these things and just to sit with them, not even necessarily to be actively thinking, but to just sit with all these things. And I was on the ship with 29 artists, and actually 28 artists, and 2 of us were scientists. That also was a bit disorienting for me after spending decades of attending science conferences and living among scientists. It was also the way they asked questions, just the ways of being were so opening for me. So that was fabulous. And I just want to read a section because a large part of the book is about that trip. And this, just to give you a taste of it. After the 10-minute talks in the salon, some of us are gathered around the bar when Brett pokes his head in and encourages us to come out onto the deck. Down in her cabin, listening through the hull of the ship, Natalie had heard the sound of seals singing. Rachel quickly connected her submerged hydrophone to a speaker she brought along for sharing sonic experiences. It's such a gift to be together on the deck, experiencing the seal song in real time. The song begins with a rapid rise in pitch, followed by a slower cascading drop, and then suddenly rises again and slowly cascades to lower tones, until there's another rise, which cascades again, this time for longer, going lower. Then there is silence, until, unexpectedly, the song starts again. I exclaim repeatedly in wonder as we are serenaded by Erignathus barbatus, the bearded seal. Like some human-made music, the song, though mournful to my ear, fills me with joy. We grin at one another and laugh every time we are surprised by the initiation of a new round of the song. I stand on the deck of the Antigua with this amazing group of people, surrounded by sea ice, mountains, and 2 glaciers flowing to the sea. On the foredeck, Eric has turned his lens on another distant polar bear. The one I had watched walk across the fast ice is now fast asleep. It's a little past midnight and light as day. So some of you may have been able to pick out this big lump on the ice in the middle there. That's a bearded seal. The ones that were singing were under the water, but that's just a taste of being on the trip. And then actually I'm going to go straight to one more reading, and that is I was actually sitting on a little knoll watching at this scene, and as I scan the scene before me and note new activities, I wonder if some projects have been abandoned. A few of the artists seem to be floundering or searching. The prospects for my own watermelon snow project are not looking good. This is something else that art and science have in common. Not everything we do succeeds. I pick up a handful of gravel from the moraine where I am sitting. It's a reminder that I am part of a nature that includes not only microbes and polar bears, but also the rocks and water that gave birth to life. Under the bluest sky imaginable, the water is sparkling to outsparkle any water anywhere, and the ice is the shiniest, most glistening ice in the world. The day seems to be celebrating. Busy at their tasks, our strange gang of humble gods is each, in their way, seeking meaning. I am awash with that most esteemed religious experience, love. And I chose that one because it is a theme that has come up both in Ayja's book and last night. This sense of love for being part of this nature that we live in. So most of my journey on the ship was really about becoming aware that I wasn't just suffering burnout. I wasn't just tired and depressed. I was actually suffering from something more complex, and that was a failure to grieve. It was a failure to acknowledge what is being lost and the pain of that loss. And I had been operating from a basis of panic and fear and this belief that if I poured myself into it enough, we could turn the shift and we could maybe avoid something really bad. Well, I still think we can avoid the worst, but there's a lot that it's too late to avoid. And I just found it necessary to recognize and acknowledge that grief. And that's the sorrow that took me a couple of years to appreciate. And it really has been a gift, a kind of deepening to understand that. So processing through this pain, coming out of it, I was able to initiate a new research program. So back after the election was over, at that point in time, I had lost my research funding. I had no graduate students left. I had closed my lab. I was no longer a molecular cell biologist. And I eventually realized that what I really am, what I really have to offer the world is science. It's who I've always been. It's who I am. And I returned to that. But I needed to find a project that would pull together both my deep knowledge of unicellular algae and my obsession with the climate. And I found that in watermelon snow, this red snow that many of you have probably seen out in the mountains. Well, not in the powder, but in the wet snow in the summertime. And these are unicellular algae that bloom. And I want to show you some photos of what they look like under the microscope. Well, there's another photo of them up in our local BC mountains. Watermelon snow, and then under the microscope we see all of these cells. So for the past couple of years, I have 3 wonderful new graduate students and a couple of great undergrads who've joined me, and we've been studying these guys. We've been discovering new species, identifying what species are there, trying to understand how these guys populate the surface of the snow every year. Lots and lots of questions. And I just want to show you some samples of some of these different algae. And it's a complete microbiome. It's a complete ecosystem on the top of the snow. Here's some rotifers that are making a living eating up this snow, eating up the red algae. And some of you will recognize the tardigrade on the right with his belly full of red algae. And to me, this is the most beautiful. These are the fungi, the bacteria, the archaea, all these different cells that are building this amazing ecosystem where these guys, the bacteria are producing vitamins and the algae are producing sugars, and these guys are all working cooperatively. This is how nature really works, is this, they can occupy these bizarre niches because they're not doing it alone, they're doing it in cooperation. And that is also one of the themes of the book. So I just want to conclude by saying that where I am now, the difference between when I finished the book and where I am now is that I've come to appreciate how terribly important it is that we get these narratives out there. Not that my story is so important, but that the fossil fuel industry has invested enormously. They're controlling the narrative from K to 12 education to our governments to media, everywhere you can imagine. They have used very sophisticated methods, and from denialism to more recently doomism, they are controlling the narrative, and we need to work to take back that narrative. So thank you for the time. I hope I didn't go too much over. I felt I rambled more than I planned, but.
Not at all. That was fascinating. Thank you. I just want to say, in regard to that slide, I want to let everyone know that in the book, if and when they read it, you willingly chose to go swimming.
Yes.
You're a tougher woman than I am by a factor of a lot. So we're going to circle around to solutions and changing that narrative. But first, let's hear from Ayja.
All right. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yeah, my name is Ayja Bounous, and thank you again so much for the introduction, and to all the organizers for inviting me to join in this event. It's really an honor to be a part of it. I'm going to share my screen. I've never done this before, so hopefully it works. Also, just a heads up that I'm sitting outside. I'm currently in Las Vegas, and there might be some road noise, hopefully not too much, but apologies if there is. And I also have a little sinus thing happening right now, so if I kind of cough or make gross noises like that, I apologize in advance for that as well. So yeah, to start off, I just want to say that I really love the theme of this talk. I think that grief is something that everyone is struggling with a lot. I think in the last few years, especially, we've really felt the effects of climate change here in the Mountain West way more than we did even 6 or 7 years ago with the wildfire smoke and the drought that's currently happening. And I just think that this topic is very timely and relevant. So thank you for choosing it. So I wrote my book, Shaped by Snow. I was inspired to write it because I was frustrated with the local ski community. As Laura said, I currently live in Salt Lake City. I was born there, and I'm very involved in the local ski community. And I started noticing this trend where on low snow years, the ski community would talk about climate change. But during the high snow years, when we'd have plenty of snow and storms coming through the mountains, the conversation wouldn't be about climate change anymore. And I got really frustrated with that because, you know, it's really hard to predict the seasons and to know what they're doing, but we can definitely see that the overall trend is going to less snow and a declining snowpack that will affect not just the ski community, but all of the ecosystems that are downstream of the American West. And so I'm going to start off by reading a passage from my book. It's not actually directly about snow. It's about when my grandmother passed away. It kind of deals with grief more. When my grandmother passed away a few years ago, we went out to scatter her ashes outside of Palo Alto, California. And while we were there, one of the big fires was happening in Sonoma County. So this is just a short passage from my book, kind of discussing that. And just a quick word that I'll talk about. I'll mention a man named Colin, and Colin's just my partner. While we were there, the air around us was hazy and pink and smelled of smoke. One of the worst wildfires in U.S. history was running rampant north of us, burning the land, destroying homes, and taking lives in Sonoma County. We could feel the dryness in the landscape and in our bones. The fire that started north of San Francisco could have just as easily have started here. Many of the dead were so burned that the only ways of identifying them was through mechanical body parts, artificial knees and pacemakers. Many who perished were older, unable to escape their homes quick enough. If the fire had originated in Portola Valley and a few months or years earlier, my grandmother and her home would have been reduced to ashes. She'd been confined to a wheelchair and then a bed during the last few years of her life. They would have had to identify her bones by her pacemaker and titanium knees. The fire came after a heavy winter. Many believe the infamous California drought gone after the large amounts of snowfall in the Sierras. Yet the fire proved to be one of the most devastating in American history. It's a misconception that a wet winter diminishes the threats of a fire in summer. If the following summer months experience a drought, then a wet winter increases the risk of wildfires. Winter sets the stage for the growing season during the rest of the year. A heavy winter replenishes watersheds and encourages vegetation growth. But if a drought follows the influx of moisture, all the new vegetation will dry out. In Northern California, the heavy winter of 2017 led to a rapid and wild growth of underbrush. The following summer drought baked that underbrush into kindling. Fire spreads much quicker and much more violently through cramped underbrush than it does through a canopy of trees. After 6 months of drought, the oak-strewn hills were ready to burst into flame at the merest spark. While the wildfires still burned, we scattered my grandmother's ashes in the hills above her house. Loading everyone into cars, we drove and then hiked up to the place she had requested. Everyone was singing. The noise was oddly muted, the moss and spongy soil absorbing the sound rather than echoing it around the forest glade. I stood at the base of a massive Douglas fir, my open-toed hiking sandals sinking into the detritus of the steep hillside. The fir's girth was hard to comprehend. Each gnarled branch stretching out of its monster trunk could have been a separate tree. Indeed, its branches were thicker than most of the surrounding trees. Its odd, towering shape was achingly familiar, one I had visited countless times with my mother. This fir is where my family scattered my grandfather's ashes 25 years ago. Whenever we came into town, my mother would set aside time for us to hike up to the tree to visit him. I never truly knew him since I was a toddler when he left, but I know the tree that his ashes fed, and I know the hike and the hillside and the landscape his body returned to. We were reuniting my grandparents in the hills they loved together, where they could watch over the adobe house they built in the valley below. I moved the guitar around my neck so my sister could pass me the bag of ashes. Taking the dust in my hands, I thought of my grandmother's laughter, of the way her eyes would light up whenever I'd bring a vase of freshly cut flowers from her yard to the place beside her bed. The substance was coarser than I expected. Breathing in the smoke of thousands of oaks and homes burning north of us, I swung my arm in an arc, the motion of a brushstroke on canvas. Her ashes created a constellation on the rough, dark bark. Turning from the tree, I thought about my family, my mother, and how, if another fire started here and this tree burned down, we wouldn't have a place to grieve. Ashes to ashes to ashes. So I want to kind of discuss grief a little bit, and give me just a second. I need to reopen my phone. As I said, climate grief is very widespread and it's very common right now. And if you're feeling climate grief and anxiety, I think it's really important to note that you're not alone. Grief, when you're alone, just can compound upon itself and make it all the harder to deal with. And it can make you feel hopeless. But I just want to acknowledge that if you're feeling this way, you're not the only one. There are countless people around the world that are feeling this way. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that everyone grieves a little bit differently. I know I struggle, excuse me, I struggle with grief when I become, emotional. I can pull into myself and I can lose all kind of hope. I can lose all drive to push forward and make a change. But I have some friends who can take that grief and who just leap right into action. And sometimes when I look at them compared to how I deal with grief, it can also make me feel kind of bad about myself and less likely to do things. So I just want to acknowledge that both types of grief are okay. And for me, my grief can kind of come and go in waves. And in that way, it's not unlike the seasons. I'll have moments where I can feel hopeful and moments where I can not feel hopeful and feel totally down. And they kind of oscillate back and forth. And I think that we need to find ways of harnessing that momentum between those oscillations and turn it into energy and action, kind of like how we harness the winds and the tides and turn it into energy. I would also like to say that I'm really into skiing metaphors, and I apologize, you're going to hear a few skiing metaphors today. And my first one is that kind of like a skier or snowboarder can harness gravity when they're in deep powder snow and make turns that will carry them down a hillside. I think we can harness grief and hope simultaneously to create that momentum. Because like when you're, and hopefully some of you guys at least know how to ski, when you're skiing in powder, if you turn too much, there's a line that's called the fall line, and it's basically the most direct way down to the bottom of the hill. And when you're skiing powder, if you turn too much out of the fall line, like if you turn too much to the side, you'll lose that momentum. And so if you think of each turn, like as one turn is grief and one turn is hope, if you turn too much into grief, you're going to lose that forward momentum. And similarly, I think if you turn too much into hope, you might kind of think that things are okay and that you don't have to be, propelling yourself into climate action. So I think that a healthy balance of both hope and grief is good. It's the opposite turn that will allow you to continue down the fall line. And it's okay to deviate from that line from time to time, as long as your momentum continues to drive you to that goal. And that goal is climate action and kind of climate peace. And just humor me as I show you what this looks like in action. Oh, whoops, I was supposed to mute that audio. That's embarrassing. Whoops. Okay, so moving forward, I think that, and I loved what Lynn said earlier about she realized that her place in this climate movement is as a scientist. I think it's essential to recognize your place in the climate movement. And some of the ways to do that are just, what are you familiar with? What local topics do you know about or are you interested in? What are you passionate about? What are your strengths? If you don't know where your place in the climate movement is, think about your strengths and how might you best put them to use. For example, if you're an organizer, oh, sorry, I'll have some truck noise here in a sec. If you're an organizer, contact other folks you think you can bring something to the table. I would say decide on 1 hour a week where you can all meet. I've known so many people who have started music festivals and retreats and stuff just because they've found a group of people that they all think they can bring something different to the table, and then they decide on 1 hour a week where they'll hop on a phone call or meet in person. And it's amazing to see what people have been able to come up with just from having this like 1 hour a week meeting time. Or if you're someone who has an idea, but you're not an organizer, find someone who is an organizer. If you're an artist, maybe find some ways of documenting grief, loss, and hope in your community. Or if you're like me, and I'm a homebody who prefers to work from the comfort of my couch, start writing op-eds, letters to the editor, or do a research on an issue that needs to be dealt with. Find something inspiring happening in your community that you can highlight. For example, for my next project, I'm teaming up with another artist who's a friend of mine and a local nonprofit called Seven Canyons Trust that's based out of Salt Lake City. And we're going to make a children's book and kind of highlight the story of Seven Canyons Trust. And the story behind that is that they're the main guy who leads the organization was in a class at the University of Utah, and his professor was telling him about, telling their class about how the Salt Lake City has 7 canyons, and each canyon has a creek that runs out of it. And all of these creeks were cemented and were piped and pushed under the ground back in the mid-century. And his professor kind of proposed this idea just casually in class that a great project would be to daylight all of these creeks, like to tear the cement up and bring them back above the road again, and to make them, places where people can kayak and stand up paddle and appreciate the watershed. And this student right out of college was like, I'm going to do that. And he has successfully started daylighting creeks in the Salt Lake Valley, which is no easy feat. And it's been super inspiring to watch that happen. And so we're going to do a children's book that's kind of loosely based on his story and the success of this community project. And later I will include a link to another Salt Lake City artist who I find her stuff pretty inspiring, just so you guys can look at another example. And then here's my next skiing metaphor. They say that the tree that you look at is the one you hit, meaning that if you're focusing too much on a tree you're trying to avoid, you'll intentionally steer yourself right into it because your body will take you where your mind is focusing. And I want to apply that to the climate movement. Oftentimes when we talk about climate change, we'll focus on the worst case scenario. What will happen if we're unable to curb, our fossil fuel inputs and unable to curb carbon emissions? And rather than focusing on what the world will be like in the worst case scenario, I think we should be focusing what the world will look like in the best case scenario. And I'm a big fan of fiction writing, and climate fiction is so often based in an apocalyptic setting where the worst case scenario happened. And I would like to see more climate fiction that focuses on what the world might look like if we're able to reimagine our cities and societies and cut fossil fuels out of our lives. And a cool magazine called Grist actually did a climate fiction competition this summer where they said just that. They were like, we're sick of hearing about like this apocalyptic climate change. We want short stories that will talk about the year 2200, where the best case scenario has happened, where we're looking at a reimagined world where we've actually succeeded. And I'll include the link to that so you guys can explore that as well. But also applying to teachers and stuff, like how do you, it's just a cool idea, I think, to have your students, instead of imagining what the world will look like in the worst case scenario, have them imagine what the world will look like in the best case scenario, and how we can solve the problems with like a spin on making it positive. And I just want to include a quick quote from Rebecca Solnit here. To hope is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. So I think if we can look at the future through a hopeful eye and through a best case scenario lens, I think it'll make moving past the grief that we might all be feeling currently a lot easier. And then to wrap up my presentation, I kind of want to just tell you guys a little bit about a story of grief and hope in my family. So my grandfather his name is Junior Bounous. And I've just included a few photos of him just so you can have a face to the name. He is a kind of a local ski legend in the Wasatch Mountains. He helped develop Snowbird Ski Resort. He helped develop a powder skiing technique. He's a total boss. He's an amazing guy to be around. And he last summer had to deal with his wife of 67 years, my grandmother Maxine, passing away. And he was 94 years old, almost 95 at the time. He's 96 now. And he is so full of life, but my grandmother passing away nearly killed him. For about 3 weeks, he was kind of in and out of the doctor's office with a failing heart because he just couldn't cope with losing his partner. And the doctor warned us that he literally could die from a broken heart. And it was really hard for my family in that moment because we could see how much life he had left in him. He's still skied, he could still hike, he's so sharp and so witty, and just everything is still there. But his grief almost ended it for him early. And so, in an effort to save his life, my family started planning adventures. We took him to the Uintas for his 95th birthday, and we camped with him and hiked around with him. We took him down to the Needles and Canyonland districts, the Needles district of Canyonlands National Park, and took him camping down there. And once the snow season started, and last year wasn't a very good season, the start was pretty terrible. But the second that there was snow in the mountains, we started taking him skiing. And we literally saved his life because we just gave him things to look forward to, gave him things to be excited about. And he, as a 95-year-old, he had barely skied 10 days the season prior, but we got him to ski 10 days before Christmas last year. And he had been kind of, his skiing had been growing weaker and weaker, but through our efforts, he actually was able to, this is a video of him during the first few inches of powder. At 95 years old, he was able to start skiing powder again. And look at him. He's so great. Sorry, this is terrible follow cam, but he's found so much joy in the world and so much hope. And by April, he was skiing so well that we arranged a heli skiing day for him. And he set the world record for the oldest heli skier at 95 years old. And so this is a photo of him from that day. And I just love how just happy you can tell he is. And when he was in the depths of his grief, finding beauty and joy in this altered world of his saved his life. And then just to wrap up, this is a place that that we visited just a few weeks ago. This is called Cathedral in the Desert. It's part of Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, which is now Lake Powell. And this is a place that up until a year ago was fully submerged. And a lot of people think by the lake, and a lot of people thought that, people would never get to see this again. My grandfather had seen this back in the day before the lake rose. And when the lake covered it, he thought that he would never get to see it again. And just a few weeks ago, the lake levels are so low because of the drought that we were able to hike up and see it. And my grandfather actually started crying while he was in this space because it was so beautiful. And we were all so surprised at how quickly this landscape has returned, even though it's been submerged underwater for 60 years. And so I want to end on this photo just because I think that it speaks to both grief of that some place like this can be submerged, but then also hope that how quickly nature can rebound even after we've done something so terrible to it. And yeah, I will include the links that I talked about in the chat box here in just a moment. But
thank you. Thank you both for those fabulous presentations. I feel like we learned a lot and got a slice into your lives. And so I have some questions, some about the issues that are brought up and some about your books. But the big, I'm going to start with the big and obvious one, which is grief. And that's the topic of this conference. And you both brought up that climate change emotions are natural, they're necessary, They need to be acknowledged both in ourselves and in others, which I think means cutting some slack, for ourselves and others. And that they vary. We can have various responses. We shouldn't expect other people to have this response we're having. And other solutions that I heard you both mention, I'm just going to throw them out. Don't turn too far into grief or into hope. Find the right balance. Rest, take adventures, maybe especially with artists. That all those artists out there on the ship looked amazing. Importantly, find your place as a scientist or as a writer or as an organizer. Like, find where your strength is and start from there. 1 hour a week. I love that idea. Get outdoors where the healing and solace can meet your heart, and lean into it, lean into nature, and start telling stories about a positive future, not so apocalyptic, but one that works. So thank you for all those solutions, because my first question is, Gen Z, or as I'm hearing it called more and more, Gen Dread. There's a lot of dread. There's a pandemic. There's climate change. There's a particular form of grief right now, and a lot of younger folks are having to make decisions with long-term lasting consequences, such as whether or not to have children, or whether or not to stay in grad school. I mean, should you be in school or should you be protesting a pipeline? Like, these are really good questions, particular to this generation. And whether or not we're part of that generation, I think we're all trying to foster, or we know people in that generation. So I guess my question for you is, any other tips for anyone in the audience who is in this space and feeling grief, about ways to, lift and raise, like acknowledge the grief, but also I've heard it's called prospective survivors. I love that term. It means you are honest and real and raw enough to imagine and face the world, the worst of it, what might be, but also importantly, follow it with like action and oomph when we can. So I just want to open up this big, broad question of like, any advice for people who might be hurting a little bit too much to really feel like they can go forth right now?
I'll jump in. I think Ayja said some beautiful things and some important things. One that I'll pick up is about being alone, and how hard that is. And I would say that a lot of people, many people that I talk to, once they get engaged with the climate movement, you make some amazing friendships and you connect with a group of people that really gets you. They understand your grief and at the same time lift each other up and support one another. And so I would say, don't try to do it alone is one important thing that I would say. And another thing that Ayja mentioned was reaching out. I think the op-eds, the letters to the editor, these are things that are incredibly important. This is how the fossil fuel industry pays people to do that. We need to get out and do it, but it's very hard to do it in isolation. There's huge barriers to overcome. Invite some friends over and write some letters together, right? Even, there's just lots of different ways to go, but I would just say engage with other people.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think community-driven action is going to play a huge role in combating the climate crisis. And I think that creating community sometimes can be a little bit of a challenge, but yeah, relationships are not only healthy for climate action, but also just healthy for you and for making sure that, I don't know, I find that I can't fight if I'm feeling depressed. And I think relationships are a good way of just making sure that you're doing all right as well. And a note about the Gen Dread, a theme in my book is me kind of like dealing with whether or not I should bring children into this world because of, the climate footprint that having children causes. And then also if I want to bring children into a world that like might not have snow and might be facing a climate refugee crisis of enormous magnitude. And just for me, one of the reasons I came to the realization that part of the reason that I kind of was thinking for a while that I might not have kids is because it kind of allowed me to disassociate myself from the future a little bit more. It's kind of like, oh, if I don't have kids, then I kind of don't have to worry as much about what the future has in store. And I can like disassociate myself from like a climate change a little bit more. And actually choosing to have kids is more like you putting yourself into the fight more. This is a personal realization that I had, obviously not going to apply to everyone, but by having kids, it's kind of like you're investing in the future. Like you have to care. It's going to force you to care. So it's just my quick little jaunt on that.
Yes, thank you for speaking to that. And thank you for all these kind of actionable steps and solutions, which is, I think, one thing we're all here to keep brainstorming about in community. We do need each other. So my next question actually had to do with narratives. You both have written books. You both spoke to the power of narrative. And narrative also can mean art or painting, I think. But here, my classes are writing op-eds right now, in fact. And so like trying to reach the non-choir, but also Kathleen Dean Moore, the great environmentalist, often says, go ahead and preach to the choir. They're the ones listening. And then maybe someone on their periphery will also be brought in. But I just wanted to talk to you about ask you about the writing of your books, the narrative, what you think narrative work can do, and what's done for you.
I can go first with this one. I think that stories are such an important part of making a difference. I think that telling stories can be, excuse me, so powerful. And that was kind of like when I was trying to figure out how best I could participate in the climate movement, and I was kind of deciding on my strengths. Telling stories was something that I was just obsessed with as a child. I loved reading, I loved writing stories, and I realized that that was kind of my place in the climate movement was telling stories. And I don't know if that quite answers.
It does, and then this is your first book, correct? And how was writing a book? Also, I'm throwing that out there for any writers out there who are struggling through getting that manuscript done. It's not easy.
No, it's not. And my book actually started as my master's thesis. And I kind of realized that I was in like a kind of a unique situation with my family being so involved in the ski industry, and then also the ski industry creating the ski industry is not exactly carbon neutral, and kind of weighing those, like, I love the ski industry, it's also contributing to climate change, and kind of how to tell that story, and then weaving in personal narrative, science, which I'm not a scientist. And so that was kind of I would spend an entire day researching atmospheric science, and it would turn into like 2 sentences in my book. So like the research is like, it's a very important part of writing, because you really need, if you're going excuse me, if you're going to write a book, like you need to be a professional. You need to know what you're writing about. But yeah, the writing process was difficult. I didn't really have like a roadmap of where I was going, and so it kind of like went all over the place, but it ended up culminating into an actual book that a publishing house picked up. So to anyone working on a book right now, just keep pushing with it.
You can do it. Yeah. And also, I'm just going to throw in that you're published by Torrey House, which is one of the leading environmental presses of the West right now. They're doing fabulous work. So check them out, everybody. Lynn, how was writing your book, or any thoughts on the importance of narrative?
Yeah, I would just add one. Oh, am I? Yeah, I would add that for me, the writing was facilitated processing. So it was through the writing that I gained a deeper understanding with the whole issues of grief and how to cope with the grief. It as I, when you're writing, you try to get each sentence or each paragraph to really say what you mean, and it's going deeper and deeper into that meaning that you gain some insights. So I think the actual process of writing is valuable in itself, even independent of the final product, whether you're producing a book for anyone else to ever read or not. And then the other point is the issue of what we put out in the world. I struggled a lot before I started it that this book isn't going to change anything. It's going to have not necessarily very many people will ever read it, and those that do, who will be impacted. And the idea that no one book will. There's been lots of fabulously famous books and bestsellers. No one book changes the world. It's a shift in the zeitgeist where people like Ayja and I are writing will connect to the group of people that we happen to connect with, and that reverberates out. And whether it's a book or a piece of art. So I tell the story in my book of attending a conference in Copenhagen in 2011, where there were bigger than life-size photographs of the protests from the climate summit that had happened there that had turned very violent. And I saw the anguish on the protesters' faces, and I saw the violence of the people that were putting them down. And although I knew the facts before, this installation of street art impacted me. It was like a punch in the gut, and it hit me. What are we up against? Why such force in putting down these protests that are so logical? We're simply trying to save our home. Why? And it was the first time that I understood in a visceral way what we're up against from the fossil fuel industry and the power that they have. And I think we never know when we're doing art, whether we're painting or we're whatever form our art is taking, when we put it out there, we never know how it's going to be received. We never know who's going to receive it, who's going to read our book, how they're going to be impacted. We put it out there and stuff happens, and we hopefully shift the zeitgeist, an op-ed, a photograph, whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that. I like thinking of all the writing going on out there in the world. Yeah, no one book is changing everything, but it's like a big, noisy, fantastic dinner party. And this conversation is going on and various people are chiming in. And by the very act of having it, we're elevating the conversation. And in fact, when we're invited to a bad dinner party, I mean, I think we all think to ourselves, man, I got to elevate that. I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about this. And that's what we're all doing by chiming in the ways that we can. And so I love that. I kind of wanted to throw a random question at you. I like surprising people with this question around the bonfire or something. But if you got to be, and I asked Barry Lopez this question last year too at the same conference, and it's just my favorite question because it leads to some honesty and raw and realness and vulnerability, I think. But if you got to be a goddess, the goddess, somehow, whatever you believe, but somehow you got to be a goddess for like 10 seconds, not much time. You got to share with other people, but you got 10 seconds to make some truths happen or be in charge. Any ideas on what you do? Put fossil fuel industry people in, like get them arrested maybe?
I think mine would be to inject everyone with empathy. Nice. Just like extreme empathy, because I think a lot of like what the story that Lynn was saying about like people putting down protests, and when these protesters are just trying to fight for their livelihood, I think if everyone had empathy where they truly could feel what other people were feeling in regards to losing the landscapes that they love, losing their livelihoods, I think that it would solve a lot of problems.
That's an awesome answer, I think.
It is. That is beautiful. I think that I would like to be co-goddesses with Ayja and add and add to that maybe an evolutionary global perspective so that people could have that empathy, but also appreciate our place in evolutionary history, our place on the globe, and have. So I in that same, in that same mix that is going into all the brains on Earth at the same time, we'll put that perspective with the empathy.
I love those answers so much. Thank you. I know it's on the spot. And it was a big question, so I'd like to ask an easier question, but it will mean just as much to me. You both love snow. I mean, the common binding agent, if you will, of your books is a real love of snow. Could you just describe snow? Or I just want to see the joy on your face when you talk about snow.
I guess I can start with this one as well. I love that snow is just like the most amazing joining of sky, atmospheric, like hydrogen bonds coming together with an oxygen atom and falling from the sky. I mean, I can't even, it's like snow, I just think is like the most miraculous thing on Earth. The way that it forms, the way that all of them have 6 points, and the way that snowflakes will literally change shape as they fall from the sky and encounter different humidity levels and different wind. And then once they fall on the ground and they like will change landscapes for massive or like, months of the year. And they like, I think snow really does just define our planet, and not that many people realize that. And I just think it's like one of the wonders of the world. I'm obsessed with it.
That was beautiful. It's actually, Ayja, one of my favorite passages in your book was it felt like a moment of enlightenment, and you described it so beautifully when you're skiing and the powder's flying up around and you're just at one with the world. You don't even exist anymore separately. You're just in the flow of that run. That was just beautiful. I would say that to me, the most magical thing are cells. And so for me, the part about snow that is so powerful is the fact that these microscopic organisms inhabit the surface, and that they, through being community, they can survive. So when life invades these more or less extreme environments, it's this ephemeral environment. It's gone. They have to start all over again next year. And it's extreme, it's cold, it's bright, it has all these features and not a lot of nutrients. No one species can survive. These microorganisms depend on each other. They depend on community. And I think that's a misunderstanding about evolution and nature and the interconnectedness of life that we are still working to overcome. That the fittest win. We miss the essence of the requirement for cooperation for life to thrive. And I think that's really exemplified on the surface of the snow. So I guess my most magic thing is cells, because that's the world I've lived in for so long.
That's so cool. That's not something that I would ever think about, is like the organisms that are on snow. It's really cool talking to you, because that's just not something that's even on my radar at all.
Now it is. You'll be skiing along thinking of all those friends out there. What beautiful answers. One of the wonders of the world and all the community there. Also, Ayja, from your book, I just want to read one line that speaks to me about creativity in snow. You write, "Snow sparks creativity, from forcing us to develop survival skills to inspiring us to create art. The six-pointed crystals have influenced humans for millennia. Snowfall requires us to work harder to stay warm and survive. but at times it releases us from our obligations and allows for leisure. I love that. We have fun in the snow, and I think there's a lot of snow-loving people here. So they're all thinking of the upcoming snow and the fun they're going to have. Before we end, we just have a few more minutes. I just want to ask, is there anything you'd like to say to the audience? Just open-ended question. Any final thoughts or topics you wish we covered?
I can see that someone had a question for Lynn on the question and answer. Don't know if you can see that, Lynn.
I can read it if
Yeah,
it says, when did you start painting? And do you paint to cope with grief, or do you do something different than you usually do? What inspired you to start painting the most?
So I've been painting since I was in my 20s, and I was hanging out with musicians, and I'm not a musician. And it was a way to occupy myself. So I painted for years. I painted music. I just was inspired by the music. And I've continued to paint for various reasons. And I don't know, it's a relief. It's something that takes all of my focus. So it's a way to have deep relaxation, because I'm really just focusing on how the colors are working together and, just letting it lead its way. So I would just say, for me, it's just relaxation.
Let's see, I think there's a question for me. As a passionate recreationist myself, skier, hiker, biker, etc., I feel in conflict with my love for those sports and the feeling of guilt for the destruction that can often result from those activities. So my question is, how do we encourage people to connect with nature and go see it, explore, and adventure, but also tell them not to destroy it? That is a really good question, one that I don't really have an answer to, because it's something that I am still trying to figure out myself. I will say that there is something that is just really important to creating those the connection with nature and with our environments and locations and places and stuff. And as much as, recreating does contribute to climate change, I think in the long run, it doesn't have, like, the fossil fuels that are being emitted from large corporations are what we should be targeting. And I'm sorry, I don't feel like this is that great of an answer, but I think that the things that bring us joy and that give us fuel to keep fighting the overall fight is more important than, getting really nitpicky about, being worried about the emissions that your car will emit driving up to the ski hill. I think that focusing rather on targeting like the big, like Shell and BP and all the big oil companies, and using the energy that you get from recreating and from being outside and hiking and encouraging others to do so, taking that energy and then fighting like the bad guys. I think that's important.
Thank you. And then how about one last question? How do you balance anger within the balance of hope and grief? And what do you do with anger? That's a good question.
Anger is exhausting. I think that anger is very valuable, and it can energize us. It can get us out acting. But it's maybe the third thread. Ayja had the two turns going down her line. If maybe we could braid in a third thread, that the third thread would be anger, that we don't want to turn too much to anger, but we need some anger. So I would thread that in with Ayja's line down the mountain.
Yeah, I agree. I think that anger can create energy, so long as you don't let it just consume you. I think a little bit of healthy anger is totally fine in the movement. Yeah.
Great. Okay, really fun question. What is the first fun snow-related activity you look forward to as soon as you find yourselves in some? Berlin, you might already have a lot of snow. I don't know.
No, we don't. We don't at all. And these days on my little island, we rarely get snow. We go years without it. And so we wait till the spring. These days, it will be the spring, and my graduate students will be leading the way up into the mountains to scoop up red snow.
All right.
So I haven't recreated in the snow for quite a while, many years.
That sounds really fun.
That does sound really fun. I live right at the basin, or at the base of this canyon called Mill Creek Canyon in Salt Lake City. And during the winter, half of the canyon gets shut down because they don't plow it. So they'll plow like the bottom half, and then it closes. And then the road going up the rest of the canyon just becomes this like snowy road, and it goes right along a creek. And it's kind of become my tradition in the last few years that once the first snowfall comes and the road closes and you get that layer of snow, just to go walking up it, like before you can really ski on it or anything, and just witness, because usually the fall colors are usually still changing, and it's just really beautiful to see the two seasons colliding right in this canyon that I am so lucky to live at the base of.
Nice. I just encourage everyone to welcome in the snow with some kind of ceremony like that, right? I think Micah needed a few minutes to wrap things up, but I just wanted to thank you both so much and encourage everyone to order these books, and please order them from your local independent bookstore, not Amazon, for a whole myriad of reasons. Local bookstores are the way to go, and to support authors, because it's a lot of work writing a book, and they need our support, and we're here to support you. So thank you for joining us at this conference, and thank you to all those who put this conference together.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Ayja. So wonderful to meet everyone.
So wonderful.
I'll echo that. Thank you, Ayja. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Laura. Really important conversation for us to be having today. I'll just, again, thank everyone for joining us this morning. Great session. We have more in store this afternoon. So please rejoin us at 1 o'clock. It is a different Zoom address, so go to western.edu/headwaters to get that Zoom address if you're not local. If you are going to be joining us on campus, wonderful. We have 2 rooms for the film screenings this afternoon, and they're both in Rady Hall. So we're not going to be using the overflow rooms in Kelly Hall today. Please join us in Rady. And again, we look forward to 2 absolutely wonderful films this afternoon, and look forward to seeing you there. Again, thank you to all of you for this morning's conversation.